months turned into a year since the businessman's stand against discrimination on that fateful flight. Life had changed in ways he never anticipated, both for him and for the countless people inspired by his actions. What started as a personal moment of defiance had grown into a movement that touched lives around the world. Though the journey wasn't easy, it taught him lessons he would carry for the rest of his life. One morning, as he prepared to board another flight, he couldn't help but reflect on how different things felt now. This time, the experience was seamless. The cabin crew greeted him warmly, addressing him by name and ensuring he was comfortable. As he settled into his seat, a first-class seat just like before, he noticed something subtle yet significant. No one questioned whether he belonged there. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes about the shift that had occurred within the industry. The airline he flew with this time was one of the companies he'd worked closely with during his campaign. They had taken his advice to heart, implementing mandatory training programs and revising their policies to prioritize inclusivity. During boarding, he overheard a flight attendant politely declining a passenger's request to switch seats without proper justification. "Our policy is clear," she explained calmly. "Everyone gets the seat they purchased." Hearing those words filled him with pride. Change was happening. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but it was happening. As the plane took off, he looked out the window, watching the clouds stretch endlessly across the sky. His mind wandered back to the past year, the highs and lows, the victories and challenges. There were moments when he doubted himself, wondering if all the effort was worth it. But then he'd remember the faces of those who reached out to thank him. A young woman once told him she finally booked her first international trip after hearing his story because she believed she wouldn't be treated unfairly. A father shared how he used the businessman's example to teach his kids about standing up for what's right. These stories reminded him why he kept pushing forward. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out a journal. Writing had become a habit for him, a way to process his thoughts and document the journey. On the blank page, he began jotting down notes about where things stood now. The travel industry was far from perfect, but progress was undeniable. Airlines had started publishing annual reports detailing their efforts to combat discrimination. Hotels introduced initiatives to ensure guests were treated equally, regardless of their background. Even smaller businesses, like car rental agencies and tour operators, adopted similar practices. It wasn't just about avoiding controversy, it was about fostering trust. But beyond the corporate changes, the real impact was visible in everyday interactions. People were more aware of their biases and willing to challenge them. Conversations about race, privilege, and fairness weren't confined to boardrooms or social media. They happened at dinner tables, in classrooms, and on public transport. The businessman often received messages from strangers sharing how they'd intervened when witnessing discriminatory behavior, or how they'd spoken up when they themselves were treated unfairly. Each story reinforced his belief that collective action could create lasting change. Still, he knew the work wasn't done. Discrimination didn't vanish overnight, and neither did the systems that allowed it to thrive. Some industries lagged behind, resistant to change. Others paid lip service to inclusivity without making meaningful reforms. And while laws had been passed in several countries to hold companies accountable, enforcement remained inconsistent. The businessman understood that vigilance was key. Progress required constant effort, not complacency. To stay involved, he continued expanding his foundation. What began as a small initiative had grown into a global network of advocates, educators, and allies working together to promote equality. The mentorship program he launched became its cornerstone, helping young people from marginalized communities build careers in fields where they were underrepresented. Graduates of the program went on to become leaders in their own right, carrying the torch of advocacy into new spaces. During one of the foundation's events, he met a teenager who reminded him so much of his younger self. The boy was bright-eyed and full of dreams, but also cautious, aware of the barriers he might face. After hearing the businessman speak, the boy approached him nervously. "Do you think I can really make it?" he asked. The businessman smiled. placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You already are," he replied. "Just keep going." Those words stayed with him long after the event ended. They reminded him of his own journey, from a young man determined to succeed despite obstacles to someone who now stood as a symbol of resilience and hope. He realized that while he may have started this fight alone, he was no longer carrying the burden by himself. Thousands of voices joined his, amplifying the message until it echoed worldwide. In quieter moments, he thought about the sacrifices he'd made along the way. Balancing his business with activism hadn't been easy. There were missed family gatherings, sleepless nights spent strategizing, and moments when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. Yet looking back, he knew it was worth it. Every compromise, every challenge brought him closer to the vision he held dear, a world where everyone could walk through life with dignity and respect. On the anniversary of the incident, he decided to mark the occasion by returning to the same airport where it all began. Walking through the terminal, he noticed subtle differences: signs promoting inclusivity, staff wearing badges that read, "Respect starts here." It was a reminder of how much had changed in just a year. Standing near the gate where he'd once been asked to give up his seat, he felt a sense of closure. This wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a milestone worth celebrating. Later that evening, he sat down to write a post reflecting on the past year. In it, he thanked everyone who had supported him, his family, friends, colleagues, and the countless strangers who shared their stories and stood beside him. "This wasn't my fight alone," he wrote. "It was ours. And though we still have a long way to go, I'm proud of what we've accomplished together." The post resonated deeply, receiving thousands of likes and comments. Many readers expressed gratitude for his courage and leadership. One comment stood out: "You reminded us that change starts with standing up, even when it's hard. Thank you for showing us the power of one voice." Reading those words, he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Tears welled up in his eyes, not out of sadness but out of gratitude for the support he'd received, for the lives he'd touched, and for the hope that tomorrow would always bring new opportunities to make the world a better place. As he closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The road ahead would undoubtedly present new challenges, but he faced them with renewed determination. He had learned that standing up for justice wasn't just about fighting against wrongs. It was about building bridges, fostering understanding, and creating a future where everyone belonged. And with that thought, he smiled. The journey wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Months had passed since the incident at the airport, and the businessman found himself reflecting on how much his life, and the world around him, had changed. What began as a single act of standing up for himself had grown into something far greater than he ever imagined. The movement he helped spark wasn't just about one airline or one discriminatory event. It was about challenging the biases that existed in every corner of society. Every day brought new developments. Airlines across the globe started reaching out to him, eager to learn from his experience and avoid similar controversies. Some were genuinely committed to making changes, while others seemed more interested in polishing their public image. Regardless of their motives, the businessman saw an opportunity to push for meaningful reform wherever he could. He didn't turn anyone away, believing that even small steps toward progress were worth taking. One of the most significant shifts came when a major international travel association invited him to speak at their annual conference. This organization represented hundreds of airlines, hotels, and transportation companies worldwide, giving him a platform like never before. Walking onto the stage, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. Thousands of industry leaders sat in the audience, many of whom had likely never given much thought to issues of discrimination until recently. He began his speech by sharing his story again, not because it was new, but because it set the foundation for everything else he wanted to say. "When I boarded that plane," he said, pausing to look directly at the crowd, "I didn't expect to become part of a global conversation. All I wanted was to sit in the seat I paid for. But what happened next reminded me of something we often forget. Fairness isn't negotiable. His words resonated deeply with the audience. As he spoke, he noticed nods of agreement and murmurs of understanding. It was clear that his message was hitting home. He went on to explain the importance of creating environments where everyone felt respected, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Discrimination doesn't always happen because someone is intentionally cruel, he continued. Sometimes it's the result of systems that don't prioritize equality. That's why we need to rethink not just our actions, but the structures we operate within. After his speech, dozens of executives approached him, asking for advice on how to implement better practices in their own companies. Some admitted they hadn't realized how pervasive the problem was until hearing his story. Others confessed they'd been hesitant to address these issues openly, fearing backlash or resistance from employees. The businessman listened patiently, offering practical suggestions and encouraging them to start small if necessary. Change doesn't have to happen overnight, he told them. What matters is that you start. Back home, the ripple effects of his efforts became increasingly visible. Schools began incorporating lessons on diversity and inclusion into their curriculums, inspired by the educational materials his campaign had created. Local communities organized workshops to discuss unconscious bias and how it affected everyday interactions. Even workplaces outside the travel industry started examining their own policies, realizing that discrimination wasn't limited to one sector. It was everywhere. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Not everyone supported the movement. Some critics accused the businessman of exaggerating the issue, claiming that incidents like the one he experienced were rare exceptions, rather than symptoms of a larger problem. Others argued that focusing too much on race and bias divided people further, instead of bringing them together. These voices grew louder at times, threatening to overshadow the positive work being done. But the businessman refused to let negativity derail him. Instead, he leaned into the criticism, using it as an opportunity to engage in constructive dialogue. During interviews and panel discussions, he addressed detractors head-on, explaining why ignoring discrimination only made it worse. Pretending. A problem doesn't exist doesn't make it go away, he said during one heated debate. Acknowledging it is the first step toward solving it. His willingness to listen and respond respectfully earned him respect even from those who initially disagreed with him. Over time, some skeptics began to see things differently, recognizing that this wasn't about blame. It was about growth. One former critic, a prominent business leader, publicly apologized for his earlier stance and pledged to support the cause. "I was wrong," he admitted in an op-ed. "This isn't about politics or agendas. It's about treating people the way they deserve to be treated, with dignity and respect." As the months rolled on, the businessman's personal life also evolved. Friends and family noticed a change in him. He seemed more confident, more purposeful. They joked that he'd gone from being a successful entrepreneur to a full-time activist, though they admired his dedication. His children especially looked up to him in a new light. At dinner one evening, his youngest asked, "Dad, does this mean you're a superhero now?" The businessman laughed, ruffling the child's hair. "No, sweetheart, I'm just someone trying to do the right thing." Though he appreciated the humor, he knew the truth was more complicated. Being thrust into the spotlight wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, when he questioned whether he was truly making a difference. Late nights spent reviewing reports or preparing speeches left him exhausted. Yet every time he received a message from someone saying they'd been inspired to stand up against injustice themselves, he felt re-energized. Those moments reminded him why he kept going. To ensure the momentum continued, he launched a mentorship program aimed at empowering young people from underrepresented backgrounds. Through workshops and networking events, participants learned skills to navigate professional spaces while advocating for equity. Many graduates of the program credited it with helping them secure jobs in industries where they might otherwise have struggled to break through. The ripple effect extended beyond individuals. Governments began passing laws requiring businesses to undergo regular audits for discriminatory practices. Advocacy groups reported a surge in funding and support, enabling them to expand their reach. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning. Still, the businessman knew the fight was far from over. Discrimination didn't disappear overnight, and neither did the biases that fueled it. But he took comfort in knowing that the groundwork had been laid. People were talking about these issues in ways they hadn't before. Conversations that once felt taboo were now happening openly, paving the way for real change. On a quiet evening, sitting on his balcony with a cup of coffee, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. Looking out at the city skyline, he thought about all the lives touched by the movement. The passengers who no longer feared being judged based on their appearance. The employees who felt safer speaking up. The children growing up in a world inching closer to fairness. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and for now that was enough. The wave of attention surrounding the businessman's story showed no signs of slowing down. The airline's decision to fire the crew involved in the incident had sparked heated debates worldwide. Some people hailed it as a victory for justice, applauding the swift action taken against discriminatory behavior. Others argued that firing the staff was an overreaction, pointing out that they were likely following flawed company policies rather than acting out of personal prejudice. Amidst the chaos, the businessman found himself reflecting deeply on what had happened. He understood why some people were upset about the firings. It wasn't hard to see how the crew members might have been caught in a system that prioritized appeasing certain passengers over fairness. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the fact that their actions had perpetuated a harmful dynamic. They hadn't questioned the request to ask him to move. Instead, they had gone along with it even when it was clear it was wrong. For the businessman, this moment wasn't just about blame, it was about accountability. He knew punishing individuals wouldn't fix the bigger problem. What mattered most was addressing the culture within the airline industry that allowed such incidents to happen in the first place. With this in mind, he decided to take another bold step. He reached out directly to the airline's leadership team, not through lawyers or intermediaries, but personally. In his message, he acknowledged the difficulty of the situation and expressed empathy for the terminated employees. "I don't believe these individuals are inherently bad people," he wrote, "but I do believe they were operating within a system that failed them, and me. If we want real change, we need to focus on fixing that system." His words struck a chord. Executives from the airline invited him to meet with them virtually to discuss ways to prevent similar incidents in the future. At first, he hesitated. Was this genuine outreach, or was it just another attempt to save face? After consulting with his lawyer and trusted advisors, he decided to give them a chance. If nothing else, it could be an opportunity to push for meaningful reforms. During the meeting, the businessman laid out his vision clearly and passionately. He proposed creating a task force made up of diversity experts, advocacy groups, and former airline employees to review the company's policies and practices. He also suggested implementing mandatory training programs for all staff, not just flight attendants, but pilots, ground crew, and management as well. These programs would focus on recognizing unconscious bias and fostering inclusivity. One executive raised a concern. "Won't this cost us a lot of money?" The businessman didn't hesitate in his response. "Yes, it will require investment," he said. "But think about the cost of doing nothing. You've already seen the damage to your reputation. Imagine what could happen if another incident occurs. Fixing the problem now isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do." The room fell silent for a moment before nods of agreement began to spread around the table. It was clear that the businessman's arguments resonated with the executives. For the first time, they seemed willing to listen, not because they feared backlash, but because they recognized the importance of change. As discussions continued, the businessman emphasized the value of transparency. He suggested the airline issue regular public reports detailing their progress toward becoming a more inclusive organization. This idea was met with enthusiasm by both sides. It wasn't enough to make promises behind closed doors. The airline needed to show the world that they were serious about reform. After several hours of intense conversation, the meeting concluded with a tentative agreement. The airline committed to launching the task force and developing the training programs. In return, the businessman agreed to pause any further legal action while the changes were implemented. Both parties understood that this was only the beginning of a long process, but there was a shared sense of hope. Word of the agreement quickly spread, drawing mixed reactions from the public. Supporters praised the businessman for his willingness to collaborate and seek solutions rather than simply punishing the airline. Critics, however, remained skeptical. Some accused him of being too lenient, arguing that the airline should face harsher consequences for its role in the incident. Despite the criticism, the businessman stayed focused on his ultimate goal, creating lasting change. He knew not everyone would agree with his approach, but he believed compromise was necessary to achieve progress. To amplify his message, he started hosting live Q&A sessions on social media, where he answered questions from followers and explained his reasoning behind working with the airline. These sessions became incredibly popular, attracting thousands of viewers each time. People appreciated his honesty and openness. During one session, a young woman asked, "Aren't you worried that people will forget about this once the news cycle moves on?" The businessman smiled thoughtfully before responding, "Of course I'm worried. That's why I'm not stopping here. This isn't just about headlines, it's about building something sustainable, something that lasts." Inspired by the support he received, he decided to expand his efforts beyond the airline industry. He partnered with advocacy organizations to launch a broader campaign aimed at combating discrimination in all forms of travel. The initiative included creating educational materials for schools, hosting community workshops, and collaborating with other industries to share best practices. One of the highlights of the campaign was a short documentary film titled Beyond the Seat. The film followed the businessman's journey from the day of the incident to the ongoing fight for equality in travel. It featured interviews with passengers who had faced similar discrimination, as well as insights from experts on systemic racism and unconscious bias. The documentary premiered at a major international film festival and received standing ovations from audiences. Through it all, the businessman remained grounded. Despite the accolades and recognition, he never lost sight of why he had started this journey in the first place. Every email he received from someone thanking him for inspiring them to speak up reminded him of the impact his actions were having. Every partnership he formed reinforced his belief that collective effort was key to driving change. Still, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, after long days filled with meetings and interviews, he sometimes wondered if he was doing enough. Could one person really make a difference in such a vast and complex system? But then he'd remember the faces of those who had reached out to him, their stories, their struggles, their hopes, and he'd find renewed determination. By the end of the year, the businessman's campaign had gained significant traction. Airlines, hotels, and transportation companies around the world began adopting similar initiatives to address discrimination. Governments took notice too, introducing legislation aimed at holding businesses accountable for biased practices. Slowly, but surely, the seeds of change were taking root. Looking back, the businessman realized how much he had grown since that day at the airport. What started as a single act of defiance had blossomed into a global movement, and while he knew there was still so much work to be done, he felt proud of what had been accomplished so far. Change wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick, but with persistence and unity, anything was possible. The businessman's story continued to spread like wildfire, reaching corners of the internet and communities he never imagined. Social media became a battleground of opinions, with thousands chiming in to share their thoughts. Some praised him for standing up against injustice, while others questioned whether the incident was blown out of proportion. But one thing was undeniable. The issue of discrimination in travel had finally been dragged into the spotlight. As days passed, the airline faced mounting pressure. Their initial apology, a generic statement claiming the situation was a misunderstanding, did little to calm the growing outrage. People weren't buying it. To many, the response felt dismissive, as if the airline was trying to sweep the whole thing under the rug. The businessman watched closely, knowing this was his chance to push for real accountability. He decided to take matters into his own hands. With the help of his lawyer, He drafted a detailed letter addressed directly to the airline's top executives. The letter wasn't just a complaint, it was a demand for action. It outlined every aspect of the incident, from the moment he was asked to switch seats to the suggestion that he move to economy class. It also included a list of steps the airline needed to take to make things right, not just for him, but for all passengers. Among the demands were calls for mandatory diversity training for all employees, independent audits of the airlines, practices, and public transparency about how such incidents would be handled in the future. The letter ended with a warning. If these changes weren't implemented swiftly, he would release more evidence to the press and pursue legal action. What happened next took everyone by surprise. Somehow, a recording of the phone call between the businessman and the airline leaked internally within the company. In the recording, the businessman's voice remained calm but firm as he explained the gravity of the situation. He made it clear that this wasn't just about him, it was about setting an example. "If you don't address this," he said during the call, "it will happen again. And trust me, the world is watching." Executives at the airline listened to the recording in stunned silence. For them, it wasn't just a wake-up call, it was a PR nightmare. The leaked audio quickly made its way to news outlets, sparking even more debate. Reporters dissected every word, analyzing what it meant for the airline and the industry as a whole. Headlines screamed phrases like "Airline faces backlash over discrimination scandal" and "Passengers stand sparks global movement." The fallout was swift and brutal. Passengers began canceling flights with the airline, opting for competitors instead. Influencers and celebrities used their platforms to criticize the company, urging their followers to boycott it. Even corporate partners started reconsidering their ties, worried about being associated with a brand embroiled in controversy. Faced with plummeting stock prices and a tarnished reputation, the airline held an emergency meeting. Executives debated, late into the night, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Some argued that firing the crew members involved would send a strong message. Others warned that doing so might come across as scapegoating, shifting blame away from the larger systemic issues at play. In the end, they decided to act decisively. Early the next morning, the airline released a statement announcing that the entire crew involved in the incident had been terminated. The decision sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. While some applauded the move as a necessary step toward justice, others criticized it as harsh and unfair. Many pointed out that the crew members were likely following orders or protocols set by higher-ups, making them pawns in a much bigger game. The businessman saw the announcement unfold on his phone. At first, he felt a mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, but also unease. On one hand, it was clear the airline was taking the matter seriously. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that firing the crew wasn't enough. True, change required addressing the root cause, not just punishing those at the bottom. Determined to keep the momentum going, he turned his focus to something bigger. He realized that this moment wasn't just about holding one airline accountable. It was an opportunity to spark widespread reform across the travel industry. Inspired by the support he'd received, he reached out to advocacy groups, activists, and experts who specialized in combating discrimination. Together, they began brainstorming ways to turn the attention his story had garnered into tangible progress. One idea stood out: creating a campaign to educate both travelers and airline staff about unconscious bias and racial profiling. The goal was simple: to foster understanding and empathy, encouraging people to think twice before making assumptions based on someone's appearance. The businessman envisioned workshops, videos, and interactive sessions designed to challenge stereotypes and promote inclusivity. But he didn't stop there. He also partnered with journalists and filmmakers to document his journey, hoping to inspire others to speak up when they witnessed or experienced discrimination. Through interviews and behind-the-scenes footage, the project aimed to humanize the issue, showing viewers that these weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper problem. As the weeks went by, the businessman found himself at the center of a growing movement. People from all walks of life reached out to share their stories, thanking him for giving them hope. Some offered to volunteer their time and skills to support the campaign. Others donated money to help fund the initiative. It was clear that his stand had struck a chord, igniting a collective desire for change. Despite the overwhelming support, the businessman knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change rarely came quickly, especially when it involved deeply ingrained biases and systemic flaws. But he refused to let doubt creep in. Every email, every message of gratitude reminded him why he was doing this. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about building a better future for everyone. In quiet moments, he reflected on how far he'd come since that fateful day at the airport. What started as a personal injustice had snowballed into something much bigger than he ever imagined. And though the journey was far from over, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. If his actions could inspire even one person to stand up against discrimination, it would all be worth it. After stepping off the plane, the businessman found himself standing in the crowded boarding area. His heart was racing, but his mind was clear. He knew what had just happened wasn't acceptable. For a moment, he thought about letting it go, boarding another flight and putting the whole incident behind him. But deep down, he felt a responsibility to do something more. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who might face similar treatment. He took a seat near the gate, pulled out his phone, and opened a note-taking app. As passengers continued to board the delayed flight, he began typing out every detail of what had happened. He wanted to make sure nothing was left out. The tone of the flight attendant's voice, the way they avoided looking him in the eye, the suggestion to move him to economy class. Every word, every action mattered. Then, he remembered the video he'd recorded during the confrontation. He replayed it to see if it captured everything clearly. It did. The footage showed the tension, the awkwardness, and most importantly, the blatant disregard for fairness. He realized this wasn't just evidence. It was a tool that could spark change. Before posting anything online, he paused. He thought about the potential consequences. Social media could amplify his story, but it could also invite criticism. Some people might call him dramatic or accuse him of overreacting. Others might defend the airline, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. Still, he knew staying silent wasn't an option. If he didn't speak up, who would? With a deep breath, he wrote a post. In simple, straightforward language, he described the incident from start to finish. He didn't use fancy words or try to sound overly emotional. Instead, he let the facts speak for themselves. I paid for my seat, he wrote. I followed the rules, and yet I was treated like I didn't belong there. Why? Because of the color of my skin. He attached the video to the post and hit publish. At first, nothing seemed to happen. A few likes here, a couple of comments there. But within hours, the post started gaining traction. People shared it on their own profiles, adding their thoughts and reactions. Soon, hashtags like respect for all and no to discrimination began trending. Strangers from all over the world chimed in, expressing support and sharing their own experiences of bias and discrimination while traveling. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people thanking him for speaking up. Some said they'd been too scared to say anything when similar things happened to them. Others admitted they hadn't realized how common these incidents were until now. Among the flood of supportive comments, a few stood out. One woman wrote about being asked to give up her seat on a train because a white passenger complained she was taking up too much space. Another man shared how he'd been questioned repeatedly by security at an airport, despite having all the proper documentation. As the post went viral, news outlets picked up the story. Journalists reached out to the businessman asking for interviews. At first, he hesitated. Talking to the media meant putting himself in the spotlight even more. But then he thought about the bigger picture. If sharing his experience could bring attention to the issue, it was worth it. So, he agreed to a few interviews, carefully choosing platforms that aligned with his goal of raising awareness. During one interview, he spoke passionately about why he refused to back down. It's not just about a seat on a plane, he explained. It's about respect. It's about being treated equally. No one should have to prove they deserve basic human decency. His words resonated with viewers. Clips from the interview were shared widely, further fueling the conversation. People admired his courage and composure. They saw him not just as a victim of discrimination, but as someone willing to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for others. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to respond. They issued a generic apology, saying the situation was a misunderstanding and promising to review their policies. But the businessman wasn't satisfied. He knew apologies without action meant nothing. In fact, he believed the airline's initial response only highlighted the deeper problem, a lack of accountability. Determined to push for real change, he decided to take things a step further. He hired a lawyer to explore legal options. Together, they drafted a letter to the airline, outlining exactly what had happened and demanding concrete steps to prevent such incidents in the future. The letter also included a warning. If the airline failed to act, he would release additional evidence to the press and pursue legal action. Word of the letter leaked online, causing another wave of reactions. Supporters praised the businessman for holding the airline accountable, while critics accused him of being too harsh. Some even defended the crew members involved, arguing that they were simply following orders. But the businessman remained focused on the bigger issue. He didn't want to punish individuals. He wanted to expose a flawed system and force it to improve. Amid the chaos, he received a surprising message. A former employee of the airline reached out to share their perspective. According to them, incidents like this weren't rare. The company prioritized customer satisfaction above all else, often pressuring staff to cater to unreasonable demands, even if it meant treating some passengers unfairly. Hearing this confirmed what the businessman already suspected. The problem wasn't isolated to one flight or one crew. It was systemic. Armed with this new information, he doubled down on his efforts. He reached out to advocacy groups working to combat racism and discrimination in the travel industry. Together, they brainstormed ways to turn the momentum from his story into lasting change. Ideas ranged from creating educational campaigns for airline staff to pushing for stricter regulations around discriminatory practices. Through it all, the businessman stayed grounded. Despite the whirlwind of attention, he reminded himself why he was doing this. It wasn't for fame or revenge. It was because he believed in a world where everyone could travel without fear of being judged based on their appearance. And if sharing his story could help make that vision a reality, he was willing to endure whatever came next. At a busy international airport, the day was just like any other for travelers rushing to catch their flights. Among them was a tall, confident man in his early 40s. Dressed in a sharp suit that screamed success, he carried himself with an air of authority. He had spent the last week attending back-to-back meetings, sealing deals, and growing his business. Now all he wanted was a comfortable flight back home. As he approached the gate, his boarding pass confirmed what he already knew. He was seated in first class, the VIP section, a reward for all the hard work he'd put in over the years. For him, this wasn't just about luxury. It was about earning something through grit and determination. It was a small reminder of how far he'd come. When he stepped onto the plane, the cabin crew greeted him warmly. He nodded politely and made his way to his assigned seat near the front. Settling in, he placed his laptop bag under the seat in front of him and adjusted his jacket. Just as he was about to relax, something unexpected happened. A man appeared beside him. This passenger was white, casually dressed, and looked slightly confused. Before the businessman could say anything, one of the flight attendants approached them. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Sir," she said, addressing the businessman, "this gentleman has been assigned your seat. Would you mind switching?" The businessman raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. This is my seat. I have my ticket right here." He pulled out his boarding pass to show her. The information was clear. He belonged in this spot. But instead of apologizing or double-checking the seating arrangement, the flight attendant seemed flustered. She glanced at the other passenger, then back at the businessman. Her tone changed ever so slightly. "We understand, sir. But if you wouldn't mind moving, we can find another suitable seat for you." Suitable seat? The businessman felt a knot form in his stomach. He looked around the cabin. Everyone else seemed occupied with their own routines, oblivious to the tension building between him and the crew. Was this really happening? Was he being asked to give up his rightful place because someone else wanted it? He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Look," he said firmly but respectfully, "I paid for this seat. I earned it. There's no reason for me to move." The flight attendant didn't budge. Instead, she suggested they resolve the issue privately, gesturing toward the aisle. But the businessman shook his head. Something about this situation felt off. It wasn't just about the seat anymore, it was about respect, fairness, and dignity. As the conversation continued, whispers began to spread among nearby passengers. Some leaned forward, curious about the commotion. Others pretended not to notice, burying their faces in books or phones. A few even gave sympathetic looks to the businessman, silently acknowledging that something wasn't right. Despite his growing frustration, the businessman tried to reason with the crew. He explained again that he had every right to stay where he was. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that the issue wasn't going away anytime soon. And then came the suggestion that sealed the deal. A member of the staff proposed, moving him to economy class. The businessman couldn't believe what he was hearing. Here he was, a successful individual who had worked tirelessly to build his career, and now he was being treated like a second-class citizen. The irony wasn't lost on him. It stung deeply, cutting through years of achievements and reminding him of the biases that still existed in the world. For a moment, he considered letting it slide. After all, it was just a seat on a plane. But then he thought about the bigger picture. If he gave in now, what message would that send? What kind of precedent would it set? No, he decided. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for what was right. With quiet determination, he grabbed his phone and started recording the interaction. His voice remained steady as he addressed the flight attendant. "If this is how your airline operates," he said, making sure his words were loud enough for those around him to hear, "then you'll hear from my lawyers and the world." And with that, he stood up, collected his belongings, and walked off the plane. Passengers watched in stunned silence as he disappeared down the jet bridge. Some clapped quietly, while others exchanged knowing glances. Whatever the outcome, one thing was certain: this incident wasn't over, not by a long shot.